All right, today on The Explainer, we're diving into one of the most epic falls from grace in all of history, Napoleon Bonaparte. I mean, how does a guy who basically conquered all of Europe end up completely defeated? Well, it all goes back to one single fatal decision. I mean, just think about that quote for a second. That's from his greatest enemy, the Duke of Wellington. He's basically saying Napoleon himself was worth an entire army. So how does a guy like that, a true military genius, lose everything? The answer isn't some big epic battle. It's actually a chain reaction, a series of decisions that all started with one massive, unsolvable problem. And to really get a handle on Napoleon's downfall, we've got to talk about the one enemy he could just never, ever beat on his own terms. And that, of course, was Great Britain. You know, historians have this brilliant way of describing the situation. It was a battle between an elephant and a whale. Just picture it. Napoleon's France, that was the elephant, totally unbeatable on land, the absolute master of continental Europe. But Britain was the whale, master of the oceans, thanks to its incredible Royal Navy. See the problem? Each one was a giant in its own world, but neither could really land that killer punch on the other. And the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 really sealed the deal. It just completely wiped out Napoleon's naval power. After that, a direct invasion of Britain, forget about it. It was totally impossible. So Napoleon, the master of the land, had to get creative. He knew he needed a whole new way to take down the master of the seas. So what did he do? He figured if I can't beat them with cannons, maybe I can beat them with economics. Maybe I can starve them out. And this, right here, this was the decision that really started the whole thing unraveling. This whole strategy got a fancy name, the Continental System. But really, it was the first and most important domino he pushed over. Napoleon famously sneered that Britain was just a nation of shopkeepers, so his logic was pretty straightforward. If I can stop the entire continent from buying their stuff, their economy will just collapse, and then they'll have no choice but to beg for peace. And you can really see his obsession with this plan just grow and grow over time. It's like he kept doubling down. First, in 1806, he says, okay, no more trading with Britain. That's the Berlin Decree. But then, of course, Britain gets clever and starts using neutral ships, so a year later, he issues the Milan Decrees to stop that. And then it gets totally extreme in 1810 with the Fontainebleau Decree, where he literally orders his men to find any British goods in Europe and burn them in public. Wild stuff. So, did this grand economic plan work? Not even close. In fact, it didn't just fail, it backfired spectacularly. It set off this whole chain reaction of disasters that would end up bleeding his empire completely dry. Here's how it went down. The blockade starts causing all sorts of problems across Europe. Smuggling is everywhere, economies are hurting. So to actually enforce this thing, Napoleon has to start using his army against his own allies. Take Portugal, for example. They were a longtime British trading partner, and they basically said, no thanks. So what does Napoleon do? He invades. And that single decision drags him into this horrible, brutal, years-long guerrilla war in Spain that becomes known as the Spanish Ulcer. It just constantly sucked up his soldiers and his money for years. And that's the core of it, right there. This plan, the Continental System, was supposed to be his genius move against Britain, but instead, it became the very foundation for his own ruin. It locked him into this vicious cycle of endless war. And think about it, he wasn't even fighting to conquer new territory anymore. He was fighting just to force people to follow his failing economic policy. It was just a constant drain on his empire, men, money, and morale. So you have to ask yourself, right? Why would a military genius, of all people, stick with a strategy that clearly wasn't working? Well, the answer isn't really about politics or strategy anymore. It's about psychology. We're talking about a fatal character flaw. And the key to this whole story, the word that explains everything, is hubris. You know what I'm talking about. That insane level of pride and overconfidence you get after winning and winning and winning. It's that dangerous belief that you're invincible, that the normal rules just don't apply to you. And look, if you want to understand his mindset, just look at his record. Before he decided to invade Russia, the guy had won 35 major battles and lost only 3. 35-3. I mean, try to put yourself in his shoes. That kind of insane, unprecedented success, it's almost guaranteed to make you feel like you just can't lose. You know, modern academics who study this stuff often talk about 4 things that lead to hubris, and it's like a checklist for Napoleon. First, a narcissistic personality? Check. A long, long series of successes? Big check. Uncritical praise from everyone around him who's too scared to tell him he's wrong? Check. And finally, that growing belief that he's just special, that he's exempt from the rules that apply to normal people. Check, check, check. He hit every single one. And this hubris, it basically made him deaf. His own advisors were warning him, telling him the invasion of Russia would be a complete disaster. But he just dismissed them. You can hear the arrogance in his own words. He said, "One good battle will knock the bottoms out of my friend Alexander's fine resolutions." He was just so sure that he could bend reality to his will because, well, he always had before.
Okay, so this is where it all comes to a head. The continental system, his out-of-control hubris, it all leads to one final, catastrophic mistake, the invasion of Russia in 1812.
And the scale of this thing is just mind-boggling. Over 500,000 soldiers. 500,000! This was the Grande Armée, the largest European army ever assembled up to that point in history. Men from all over his empire marching into Russia. So why? Why did he do it? It all comes right back to that first domino we talked about. Tsar Alexander of Russia was feeling the economic pain, so he started trading with Britain again. He defied the continental system. And for Napoleon, this wasn't just a policy disagreement. He was trapped by his own rules and blinded by his own pride. He saw it as a personal insult, a challenge he had to answer with overwhelming force. And this is the result. Of that massive army of over 500,000 men, fewer than 20,000 made it back alive. Just let that sink in. The retreat from Moscow is still one of the absolute worst disasters in the history of warfare. And the tragic irony is that the Grand Army wasn't even destroyed in some glorious climactic battle like Napoleon always wanted. No, it was wiped out by starvation, by the sheer cold of the Russian winter, and ultimately by Napoleon's own stubborn refusal to admit he'd made a mistake and turn back until it was way, way too late.
So that catastrophic loss in Russia, that was the last domino to fall. It just completely shattered the myth that Napoleon couldn't be beaten. All of a sudden, he looked vulnerable, and his enemies noticed. A whole new coalition of European powers rose up against him, bolder than ever. His army was gone, his allies bailed on him, and by 1814, it was over. He was forced to abdicate,
which leaves us with this really fascinating question to chew on. When you look at the whole story, from that first decision about the continental system all the way to the frozen fields of Russia, it's clear his downfall came from his own choices. But here's the thing, were those bad choices, that fatal flaw of hubris, somehow inseparable from the very same genius that made him so great to begin with? It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Maybe the thing that makes someone rise so high is the very same thing that guarantees they'll eventually fall.